I think it's about time that we talk about the very real possibility that Cinder may now be in line to inherit 2 more Maiden powers on top of the Fall Maiden powers she already possesses. The Spring Maiden powers from Raven Bronwyn and the Winter Maiden powers from Penny Polendina, now that she's had the chance to potentially absorb a small amount of the Maiden powers from their current users. In Volume 5, when Cinder fought against Raven, she was able to siphon a small amount of aura or magic from Raven using her Grim Arm. And the exact same thing Cinder did to Penny in episode 5 of Volume 8. In both of these cases, if Cinder was able to absorb even just a tiny fraction of the Maiden powers from their users, then that would mean if either of them were to pass on and the Maiden powers were to seek out their next host, Cinder could be the next in line based on her having even just a tiny portion of it, because the Maiden powers might want to be made whole again. This was a concern that Ozpin had back in Volume 3 when it came to Amber. Cinder had absorbed a large portion of the Maiden powers. We're not exactly sure how much of it was. I would argue it's probably around 50-50, but Ozpin wasn't sure what would happen if Amber were to simply pass away. It's possible Amber could have been thinking of her attacker, and thus it would have gone to Cinder. Or it could have been possible that the Maiden powers themselves just wanted to be whole yet again. Either way, Cinder did kill Amber, and while in a coma, the Maiden powers did end up transferring to Cinder. We're not exactly sure what method it was, whether Amber was thinking of Cinder at that moment, her attacker, or if the Maiden powers just wanted to be whole and kind of overwrote the rule of the Maiden powers that they would pass to the person last in the thoughts of the current Maiden. And if this second option is the case, then if Raven Bronwyn passed away, likely she would be thinking of her daughter, Yang, or Ruby Rose in memory of Summer Rose, or something like that. If Cinder possessed a small portion of the Maiden powers, then it would be overwritten. Instead of going to either of those two girls, the Spring Maiden powers would instead go to Cinder. And similarly with Penny, she would likely be thinking of Ruby Rose, or possibly even Winter Schnee at that point, but instead, if Cinder did possess a portion of the Maiden powers, even just a tiny fraction, the powers might want to be whole and go to Cinder instead. There is a lot of confusion as to what exactly Cinder was able to siphon away from Raven and Penny, whether she was just siphoning away aura, or if she actually did get a portion of the Maiden powers. This question was actually asked recently in an AMA, and Eddie Rivas answered no. The Maiden powers still belong to Raven, which taken at face value does mean that Cinder was not able to get any of the Maiden powers from Raven and thus was only absorbing aura through her Grim Arm. But that scenario doesn't exactly make sense in my mind. For one, I always take answers from authors with a grain of salt when it comes to questions concerning plot elements, because they have to be very careful how they answer things so they don't spoil the future events of, in this case, the RWBY series. If it is the case that Cinder did get a small portion of the Maiden powers, and Eddie confirmed it at this time, then that would not only confirm that Cinder may be next in line to inherit the Spring Maiden powers, but could also hint at Raven Bronwyn's potential death in the RWBY series, something that would be very significant. She is a very important person in Yang's life, and not to mention being the Spring Maiden, very important to the overall plot of the RWBY series in general. Even though the relic is removed from the vault currently, the Spring Maiden can still be very impactful in the story, so that's something that they probably want to keep under wraps and keep the impact as much as possible for the events in the RWBY series. This is the same when it comes to confirming whether characters are dead or not. If it seems like a character died on screen, the authors are pretty much never going to say, oh yeah, that character's alive, when posed with the question, is this character actually dead? They're always going to say, yes, the person's dead. Subvert the expectations, and then when the character comes back alive, as was the case with Penny in Volume 7, then it's a good surprise for the viewers. The impact is still there. Whereas if they confirmed it beforehand, then everyone would just be expecting that character's return later on, or in this case, expecting Cinder to get the Maiden powers at some point. So questions from authors have to be handled very carefully. Frankly, the Spring Maiden powers do still belong to Raven. Cinder may have only been able to absorb just a tiny portion of them, thus not really impacting the power that Raven has, or really augmenting the power that Cinder has. Not that would be able to add any more power to hers, just enough to get the Maiden powers to come to Cinder instead of going to someone else. That's my thinking exactly. And it doesn't really make sense that Cinder's Grim Arm would be absorbing aura in those situations, when she latched on to Raven and latched on to Penny, because that would be a very disadvantageous position for Cinder to be in if all she was trying to do was get the aura. We know that the Grim Arm itself does have the capability to absorb the Maiden powers. That's why Cinder attacked Vernal back in Volume 5. She looked for the Maiden powers, was able to take Vernal by surprise, and so her aura wasn't up. She was able to stab her directly and wasn't able to sense the Maiden powers in Vernal. Unfortunately, Vernal did die from these wounds, but that's why Cinder ended up targeting Raven. And because it was already established that Cinder's Grim Arm could sense and absorb the Maiden powers, that's why she latched on to Raven and Penny in an effort to obtain the Maiden powers. So, if Cinder was absorbing aura through this Grim Arm, and we are left with the conclusion that a Maiden has to have their aura broken before the powers can be absorbed by Cinder, then it doesn't make sense for Cinder to latch on to the Maidens with this Grim Arm. It puts her at a really disadvantageous position, because the Maidens would still have their aura, still be able to use their magic, still be able to fight back. In this most recent case of Penny especially, it really doesn't make sense for Cinder to latch on and only try to absorb aura or deplete Penny's aura before trying to absorb the Maiden powers from her. If she needed to absorb the aura first and then the Maiden powers, she would go about that a different way, I would think. Break the person's aura first. That would leave them at a state of exhaustion, and also leave them much more vulnerable for Cinder to be able to walk up and latch onto Penny with her Grim Arm. Penny was in a situation where she was using all of her blades to hold up the platform in Amity Coliseum, and both of her arms and the Maiden powers to freeze the columns. Cinder literally had a free hit. Later in the episode, she conjured that magic spear and went to go impale Penny. If she would have done that at that point when Penny was immobilized and couldn't counterattack, she would have been able to land that hit, possibly be able to break Penny's aura right then and there, and then take the Maiden powers if that was the case. But instead, Cinder decided to latch onto Penny with the Grim Arm. It implies to me that Cinder was able to get to the Maiden powers right then and there, instead of having to latch on, absorb through Penny's aura, deplete that first, and then get to the Maiden powers. It wouldn't make sense to have to get that close combat to get through the aura first, as it just seems disadvantageous overall. Now, Cinder wasn't exactly thinking rationally at that point, similarly when she went to attack Raven, so it could be possible that this is all part of Cinder's mindset, and she just made bad choices at that time, going for the Grim Arm and trying to absorb through the aura, get the Maiden powers, instead of breaking the person's aura first, like her, Emerald, and Mercury did against Amber. They broke her aura first, and then were able to absorb the Maiden powers. So, maybe it's just Cinder's mindset in these situations, and she was acting a bit rashly and put herself at those positions where she ended up losing both of the fights. But still, I think it just makes more sense that Cinder was able to absorb a small portion of the Maiden powers from Raven and from Penny. That's just that brief time she was able to latch on got her enough to trigger the Maiden powers to transfer to Cinder if either of the current Maidens were to pass on. There's one other thing we also can't forget from Volume 3, when Ozpin was talking with Pyrrha. There was no way for Ozpin to actually just transfer the Maiden powers from Amber to Pyrrha, but he was able to transfer the thing that the Maiden powers were bound to, Amber's aura. That's exactly what they were doing, transplanting Amber's aura onto Pyrrha. So if Cinder was absorbing Raven's aura and Penny's aura, then it would stand to reason that the Maiden powers, or a portion of them, would be dragged along with it. So it seems to me, at least, that all of the indications are pointing to Cinder having a small portion of each of the Spring and Winter Maiden powers. So, my rambling aside, if this is the case that Cinder has a small portion of the Maiden powers and is next in line to obtain the Spring Maiden and Winter Maiden powers, then that could happen by the end of Volume 8. Penny is currently deactivated. We don't know if that's going to trigger the Maiden powers to leave Penny, or if she's going to be very vulnerable for Cinder to find her and absorb the Maiden powers then, and Frankly, as well, I could also see that the mid-season finale, the episode airing today, as of the releasing of this video, could end off with, I don't know, a portal opening and Raven coming to Atlas's aid. So there is a decent chance that there's going to be 3 Maidens in Atlas, which could pose for a very interesting fight if all of them were to face off, but outside of that, it could be that Cinder gets all of the Maiden powers. But with the way that things have played out in Volume 8 so far, it looks like Cinder might have a different fate in store for how much she's disobeyed Salem already, and, well, with the Hound being an experiment for Salem, I think that might be in store for Cinder's future. The Grim Arm being able to possibly corrupt her entirely, turn her into a second Hound, etc. Made an entire video on that, and possibly that Salem might have found a new replacement for Cinder, another Maiden that would be a much more obedient vessel. So there is a number of options that could be possible for Cinder's future, whether it's exiled from Salem's faction, whether it's taken over, corrupted by Grimm, replaced by another Maiden, or someone who does fulfill the role of Salem's vessel for all of the Maiden powers. So with that being said, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think that it is likely that Cinder might be next in line to obtain the Spring and Winter Maiden powers from Raven and Penny respectively? That when she latched onto them with her Grim Arm, she was able to get just the tiniest portion of the Maiden powers? That Eddie Rivas in the AMA wasn't exactly truthful because it would spoil future events of the RWBY series. If Cinder was only able to absorb aura from Raven and Penny, that she needed to absorb the aura first to get to the Maiden powers, how exactly does that make sense? Was it that Cinder was only acting irrationally, that she was focused on getting the Maiden powers, she didn't see the disadvantageous position she was putting herself in, thus causing her to lose the fight, etc. But, you know, it just doesn't make that much sense to me, and I would love to know your guys' thoughts. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to see more analyses, more theories, more RWBY content in general, make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.